Hi, hello Sarah, lovely to have you here. Just give it a few more minutes and I got cut off before, so hoping that some more people will join back up again. Good morning everybody. Right, we're going to try this again because my connection seems to be a little bit dodgy today. Good morning. So, as I was saying, what we are trying to do this morning is to kind of have an opportunity to come together as a sort of parenting community to think about some of the kind of particular challenges of parenting, and also just to kind of create a bit of a community on here because, you know, we often will type in our little squares commenting on things, but it's hard to find an opportunity to really come together as a group, and that's what I'd really like this space to be. And it is really a kind of chance to reflect on the meetings that I do once a month called The Village, which I run in East Finchley in North London. So I'll spend the morning kind of going over a little bit what we talked about yesterday, because we had a meeting last night. And then also, just if you've got any particular questions, then please feel free just to kind of type them in. And what I'll do is I'll just kind of ramble for a little while talking about the kind of topics that we discussed last night. And then if you've got any questions, then just type them in and I'll come back to them in a little while. Just to say, as I will do kind of every time we do this, I'm going to be doing this on the first Friday of the month, always at 9:30, and it will be to reflect on the topic of the evening before, but also if you've got anything that you really want me to cover, then just let me know and I can kind of prepare to talk about that topic instead or as well. But we are on social media, so just to be aware of confidentiality. So, you know, obviously this is a public space. If you would like to ask questions that you don't feel like asking in a public forum, then you're really welcome to just send me a direct message afterwards and I can answer it. We can just answer it in private. So hello everybody who's just joining. Please do feel free to introduce yourselves. It would be lovely if we could feel like we're all kind of getting to know each other, and creating a bit of a community on here as well. If you would like to, we also do have a Facebook group for the village, so if you've got questions that come up or you'd just like to chat to other parents, then I'll put the link for the Facebook group up after we finish this morning. So, before I got cut off before, I was just talking about the session that we had last night. And last night we had this brilliant guest speaker who is a psychologist called Jasmine Chin. Hello to both of you. Hello, 7-week-old too. And Jasmine is a clinical psychologist and she works in a few different services. So she works in a charity called Quorum, which is one of the oldest charities in the UK, and they work a lot with families who are dealing with adoption issues, and also general kind of other, it used to be part of the Foundling Hospital, so that was kind of that link through the charity, but she works kind of with children and families in that setting as a clinical lead, and she also works in a child and adolescent mental health service in North London, and she also has an independent practice too, so she's doing lots of different things but sees families in lots of different settings. She's also a systemic therapist, which basically means that she, rather than kind of other sorts of therapy that often can be criticised for seeing somebody sort of as existing in a bit of a vacuum and problems become their personal or individual responsibility, systemic theory really looks at all of the different systems around us and how they might be impacting on how we function, on how we relate to people. So we talk a lot about stories in systemic therapy and in systemic theory. So we talked a lot last night about the kind of different stories that we tell about family life. So yes, she was a really sort of interesting person to have and somebody that I've wanted to have at the village for a long time. I'll share her details after this as well, but she's not a social media user very much. Hi everybody. Hi Nikki, lovely to see you. And if you've got any questions as they arise, please feel free to type them in and please do introduce yourselves. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the kind of topic that we talked about last night, which was thinking about the kind of uniqueness of families. So all of the different stories that we tell about family life. and particularly with an interest in looking at blended families, so families where there might be stepchildren or there might be other adults involved in co-parenting. But we also then had a wider discussion about all of the different ways that we can make up family and a lot of the kind of things that we don't talk about very much. So lots of different routes to becoming a family. So we talked about the process of IVF or donor conception. We also talked about same-sex relationships where people have children, and we also talked about single parents too. So lots of the kind of different types of family that we don't always see represented in the wider world. And one of the things that we talked about at the beginning at length was that the norm is still, when we talk about family, two parents, usually a heterosexual couple. Often what we would see in adverts or in the media is that they would be white, they would be able-bodied, they would tend to have two children who are their own children. And one of the things that Jasmine pointed out is that we usually see that they're getting it right all the time. So that is the kind of norm that we have to live up to. And we talked about how powerful those stories can be, because they very insidiously kind of seep their way into our psyche and affect the way that we think about our own families. And that might be the families that we were brought up in, but it might also be our own families that we're creating with our children in the present. And we talked about the comparisons that we can make without even realising it. So if we have a kind of normative story that this is kind of what family life is supposed to look like, it can feel quite unsettling to know that your family setup is not exactly like that. But also how that affects all of the people around us, so that we will often come up against other people's assumptions around what our family setup is like. So, for example, if we're talking about adoption, let's say. So one of the stories that Jasmine talked about was a family that she's worked with where what the daughter had a particularly striking feature, and people would always comment, oh, where did she get that feature from? It's not from you, so it must be from her dad. And this was a parent who had decided to have a child on her own. So all of those assumptions that we make about the fact that A, there's a father around, that B, that the child is genetically linked to us, means that what will happen when we don't have that set up in our own family life is that we always have a choice to make. Are we going to talk about, actually, we might have had a different route to having that child, or we might have a different family makeup, which is obviously sharing kind of what can be for lots of people hugely private information, or do we just kind of smile and nod and walk away and end up kind of feeling quite uncomfortable about the assumption that might have been made. But we also talked about how that often happens in families that are kind of more normative. So, often we do make assumptions. One of the classic assumptions is that when people maybe get married, that immediately the question is, so when are you going to have children? So there's assumption there that you want to have children, that you're able to have children, that you're not already trying, maybe it's been difficult for you. So lots of things that we kind of just, without thinking about it, that normative story really seeps in and starts to affect the way that we view our own families, but also how we relate to other families. So we just talked about how powerful those stories can be. And it would be interesting, I guess, to hear from you how that might affect you in your family life. That are there assumptions made about you within your family that have maybe affected the way that you parent, or that you've had to navigate, so the kind of things that maybe you've learned to have to challenge. So one of the parents who was there last night talked about an experience where actually she's just quite confrontational about other people's assumptions about her family setup, and will just, very openly say, this is our story. And actually that's given her children real pride in their kind of what might be seen as being a more unusual setup. So there's real positives to that, but obviously that takes quite a lot of bravery to do that. And if you also are feeling unresolved about the route that you might have taken to becoming a family, it can obviously sort of touch some really difficult feelings if there are still things that are there that haven't quite been processed. See you later, Claire. I'm just going to have a look through quickly to see what people are saying. So hi everybody who's joining, please do feel free to introduce yourselves if you haven't already. Hi, just want to say hello. I'm a student midwife and mother of two. I heard you on a podcast. Oh, would love to hear about your dissertation. Please do let us know. what it is that you're researching. That would be great. Mama to my adopted son and 2 biological children. Lots of cover in the USA on adopted biofamilies, but very little info spoken about here in the UK. Yeah, I can absolutely agree with that, because I think it's something that certainly was never covered on my training. In my training, that talking about normative stories, really all we learned about was that kind of heteronormative family setup with children who have been, born biologically, and no kind of thoughts about different fertility journeys, about different routes to becoming parents, something that I've learned entirely from the people that I've seen. Let's see, Nikki. As an actor, when I cast for adverts, there's still the story of fun dad and eye-rolling harassed mum. That is such a powerful story too, isn't it? I wonder whether it would be useful for you just to think about how that affects you. So thinking about assumptions, but also, are there times where you feel that you're kind of falling into that very familiar groove? I know that there's times for me when I feel like, I am being the archetypal harassed mum and my partner is being the kind of fun dad. And, I even remember my own mum saying that to me when I was growing up, that one of the parents often has to be the bad guy. We fall into these very familiar grooves, don't we, when we're thinking about stories. And it can take a lot to take a step back and think critically about our own values and what we want from our family life. I always think it's a really nice exercise to do as a family. Some people talk about kind of family rules, but it's really nice, especially if you've got older children, to think about your family values and actually what is important to you as a family. What are the things, and it might be having fun together, it might be being kind to each other, it might be both of those things. But it's really, I think, sometimes a really lovely exercise to bring you together to connect as a family, to think about, what is it that you want to have as your family story, which maybe is quite different to the other family stories that we see kind of out there in the wider world. So yeah, we talked a lot about how family is usually represented and how our own experience might differ from that. And then we also talked about kind of the particular, I guess, the kind of much more hidden messages around family life. So those kind of things that sort of happen behind closed doors that we often don't talk about more widely. That idea that actually, we have an ideal to live up to, that people don't have conflict, for example. And then we talked about how difficult that is when you might be in a different kind of family setup. So one of the things that we talked about a lot last night was, what do we do in blended families where you might be trying to co-parent with somebody that you're no longer in a relationship with? And then again, what happens when you begin a new relationship with a new partner and have to introduce them to your child? And equally, what about if they have other children, and all of those dynamics that can feel really complicated? And one of the things that I really wanted to share with you was a conversation that we had about resolving conflict. So we talked about how in co-parenting relationships, there might be very familiar conflicts that come up time and time again. So the example that was given last night was a mum who, the child's father had phoned and said, can I pick them up from school? And she'd said, yeah, but can you just make sure that you give him dinner? And this had caused a whole conflict around, him feeling, I suppose, that he was being treated as somebody who wasn't a responsible parent, and her feeling that her actions were being taken as criticism when they weren't intended to be that way. And we talked about how we can very, very quickly get into these very familiar conflicts where we're both put in these, or both in a partnership or with other relationships too, where we're put in these positions where we often find ourselves treated in a particular way. So we feel like we're being represented in a way that doesn't feel kind of accurate to us, and then we end up kind of bouncing off each other in that way. And what we talked about was how difficult it is when you're not living together to really kind of repair those conflicts that come up time and time again. So often what might happen in a relationship where you are together and you're living together is that you might have a very familiar conflict, and we all have those arguments that kind of come up over and over again in thinking about the kind of ways that we're represented and think about our partners. And if you're interested, I can talk a little bit about why that might be, why we kind of get into that familiar groove. But when you are co-parenting and you're not living together, it can be really difficult to find the time and space to kind of hash that out together and think that through. So we talked about what we want to model for our children in conflict resolution. So that a lot of the time when people are not only just co-parenting, also if you have a stepchild who is visiting occasionally, so somebody who's not there with you all the time, there is a real pressure to make that time together absolutely perfect. So, those kind of ideas of being good enough get chucked out of the window, because you want that time together to be as beneficial as it can be, with as conflict-free as it can be. And that adds a lot of pressure on everybody, but also means that then you don't always get the opportunities to kind of sit down and really think through, how do we resolve these conflicts that keep coming up. So one of the things that we talked about was that actually, how do we model that it's okay to disagree with one another, particularly in a setting where a conflict previously might have led to a separation. So for that child, actually conflict can mean something that can feel quite catastrophic or quite serious. So having those repeated examples where we as parents or as responsible adults to that child can come together and sometimes in front of them, talk about something that might have happened that has made us angry, and then show them or demonstrate to them that it is possible to resolve a conflict in an adult way using all of our kind of reasoning capacities, so that they know that conflict is something that can be navigated. And of course that's something that applies to all families, not just families where parents aren't living together, but it becomes particularly, I think, tricky when you're not living together to have those conversations in front of children, or possibly to have those conversations in front of children. But we talked about the kind of alternative, which is what can often happen where people are sort of left stewing on their feelings, and we can demonstrate that we might feel annoyed or resentful in different ways, and children are so sensitive to our feelings and pick up immediately when a conflict is happening. So being able to kind of navigate that process together is something that can be really beneficial. One of the things that Jasmine talked about, which I think is helpful for all of us to have in our minds, is that the priority for all parents is to keep the child in the centre of their minds. So often when conflict can arise repeatedly, it's really helpful for both partners to think about what's best for the child, but also what does the child need to see in thinking about that dynamic. Of course, it's way easier said than done, because of course we all have, when we have separated from people, there might be hurt feelings still there. When we're talking about conflict resolution, one of the things that we talked about last night was that it needs for people to be able to be adult, and it needs for people to be able to use their frontal lobes in order to be able to reason through a conflict, and that's not always easy when emotions are running high. And sometimes we then talked about that there might also be situations where actually our obligation to protect our child becomes more important than resolving a conflict. I hope that all made sense. We're sort of talking about really, sort of very in-depth discussions that we had last night and trying to summarise them all for you. Hello, good morning everybody. It's really lovely to see you all. Please do feel free to introduce yourselves. I was just saying at the beginning that if you'd like to continue the discussion afterwards, then I'll put up a link to our Facebook group. But today we're talking about families and how different families can be, and how unique we all are as families, and the different stories that we tell, and particular kind of ideas around co-parenting with parents, with partners that we might have separated from, with thinking about our children in all of that, and stepchildren sometimes, but also thinking about other family setups, such as families where children have been adopted or have come through donor conception. So let me just check back to my notes from last night and see if there's anything else that I wanted to talk about. I guess thinking not just about conflict, but the idea of going back to the idea about assumptions that people might make about our family setup and how we've created our families. One of the things that we talked about was different routes to becoming a family. So people who go through IVF And often that might be a very long and a very painful process for people, or people who've chosen to have a donor conception. So that might be single parents, or it might be a different route via IVF. And again, one of the things that we were talking about was around the assumptions that people make about your children and how those children have come to be in your life. And often there's a lot of I suppose there's not a lot of credence given to thinking about how complicated it might have become for somebody to become a parent, and how often there are a lot of unresolved feelings around having had to go through what can be a very, very tricky process. And we talked about how that can create a story in itself. So if you have had a very long route to becoming a parent, that child can become in your mind somebody who is incredibly precious and incredibly longed for, as all children are. But when you've had a very long route to get there, that child becomes the goal that you might have had in your mind for many, many years. And often that journey can be very, very tricky and emotionally incredibly taxing. So we talked about how difficult it then is to have feelings of ambivalence about parenting or about that child. And one of the things that I talk a lot about with my clients is that when you have had such a long journey to becoming a parent, it becomes very difficult to then talk about the parts of parenting that you're not enjoying. And I just thought it might be helpful to talk a little bit about that, about ambivalence, because both when you've had a difficult journey to becoming a parent, but also just generally when you have these very powerful stories that parenting should be done in a certain way, that there is an ideal parent that you're supposed to be aspiring to be, then any time that we talk about the more negative aspects of parenting, you can almost feel like you are betraying the story, or that you're letting yourself down as a parent. And I don't know whether any of you can relate to that kind of pressure to find the good in everything. And I think that is a story that is around a lot, particularly on social media. I mean, we're sort of getting a bit of a backlash against that, I think, but there is this idea that, the kind of, you must enjoy every minute, that people often talk about hearing from often elderly relatives or other parents. This time goes so quickly and you must enjoy every minute. And actually, if at that moment you're really not enjoying it, it can become very hard to then turn that around and say, this is not what I expected, or this day has been particularly hard. And the only way, in my mind, kind of going back to those sort of systems ideas, that we can really start to challenge that is by talking about it, which again is something that is happening more and more on social media. And not just talking about how difficult parenting can be. And that was one of the points that Jasmine made last night, was that one of the things that makes family life much easier is acknowledging actually just how hard it is. That there might be moments of joy, but there are also so many moments where life is just very mundane, and we're washing up for the 100th time that day, and we're solving another conflict with our children. We're kind of getting them out the door. All of those things that probably lots of you have come back from the school run recently. So all of those kind of things that we have to do day in, day out, when we have this story that family life is joyful and wonderful and magical all the time, actually that can create such a feeling of discomfort in us that this is really not what I expected, and sometimes this is really not what I signed up for. So just being able to talk about not just the bad bits but the mundane bits too can be such a powerful way of just getting that, sort of starting to really challenge that normative story that family is, this is our kind of ideal family setup, so that eventually we can kind of move towards a story which is much more realistic, that family is messy and family is difficult and family is also joyful. So the more that we talk about that, the more we can kind of challenge that prevailing story. So it would be interesting to hear from you whether that's something that you've experienced, whether you kind of felt that family life was supposed to be a certain way, and what's kind of surprised you about becoming parents. Please do feel free to comment as much as you want to, and towards the end I'll kind of go through and read through everybody's comments. So the other thing that I just wanted to talk about was something that, so Jasmine, being a mindfulness teacher, talked about how we can, what we can do to kind of support family life. And she works with such a diverse range of different families. So I asked her what are the kind of key things that she finds support all different kinds of families. And one of the things that she said was not only just acknowledging the hardships, but how difficult we can sometimes find it to look for the joys. And she used the example that often we think about the joy of family life as being the big events. So, you know, the kind of weekend away to Legoland, or, you know, the amazing, activity that we've got planned for our kids' birthdays. You know, those kind of big events that happen every so often, and that can create a lot of pressure. And it's something that I see a lot when around the summer holidays, where before the summer holidays people are starting to think about how they're going to entertain their children during that time. And it can be a really difficult time, because it's particularly financially, you know, if you don't have the resources to be able to take your children out to do all of these amazing things that we see on Instagram, then you can feel like you're kind of letting them down in some way, or you're not providing the opportunities that other families do. Again, that idea about what other families are doing, what's kind of normative to us. But actually, what we talked about was that what are those kind of very ordinary moments. So, sorry, I just got cut off for a minute there, sorry. So yeah, thinking about just the ordinary moments that we share together, the snuggling on the sofa. You know, I've got a friend whose kid's favourite thing is when she does a picnic tea, which is essentially those days when she's just so tired that she can't even face putting the oven on. So she does sandwiches and crisps and a chocolate bar, whatever, an apple, and they eat it in front of the TV. And those are her children's favourite days, and those are often the days where she's just got no resources left. So it's looking for the joy in those kind of really ordinary moments. And also, because we do have this kind of negative bias, you know, as human beings, we tend to look for the things that raise our anxiety, the things that, that we're doing wrong, the things that our children are doing wrong. It can be really helpful to just tap into looking for the things that we can not only praise them for, but also the things that we can just take pleasure from. So, you know, really taking a moment to look at your child and really see them, you know, which is something that when we're together all the time can be quite difficult to do, and we can forget very easily. You know, thinking about the things that you do together that you really, really enjoy doing. And often it is those kind of very boring, mundane things, like just, you know, standing in the kitchen together, chopping vegetables, or going for a walk together so that you can actually hear what's going on with their day. So, you know, kind of taking those sort of ordinary moments of everyday life. And I mean, that's really all that mindfulness is, kind of actually trying to really tap into what is happening in that moment and be able to take some appreciation from it. And also doing that for ourselves as well as parents, you know, checking in with ourselves and noticing what it is that we're doing and what we're providing on a daily basis. So we talked a little bit last night about the kind of other stories that we tell about mindfulness. So mindfulness is something that is so popular at the moment, but can often add an additional pressure because it becomes something else that we're not doing. You know, it's another aspect of our self-care that we're ignoring. So it just gets added to the to-do list. But actually, what Jasmine pointed out was that mindfulness is literally just the action of drawing our attention back into the present. That's it. So it doesn't matter where you are or what you're doing. It's literally just taking that moment to say, this is what I'm doing right now, and just focusing your attention. And the practice of mindfulness is just doing that repeatedly. So it doesn't have to be a 40-minute body scan. It can just be, here I am playing Lego with my children. Here I am feeding my baby, and just really noticing what is going on in that moment. Jasmine also talked, she's got a special interest in breath work, so using the breath to come into the body and get into that kind of mindful moment. So she did a really lovely mindfulness exercise with us towards the end of the session last night. But again, you know, thinking this is something that I talk about all the time because family life is so hectic. And often we're very, very busy, but using our breathing just to be able to drop back into our bodies, always doing that kind of breath in through the nose and long, slow breath out through the mouth that can just really ground us back in that present moment. That was kind of all that I was going to cover today, but please do feel free to let me know if there's anything else that you want me to touch on. I'm just going to go back through. I just feel like I kind of ramble on here, so I hope that I've made sense. And if you've got questions that I haven't talked about, please feel free to get in touch with me after this. So you can either direct message me or come onto the Facebook group to start a conversation on there. So let's see. Nikki said, sometimes words come out of my mouth and they're not my own but learned behaviour. I can talk about that a little bit if you want. So that is something that I talk about a lot. And any other questions? Absolutely. Such a long journey to having children through lots of deep heartache and loss. The tough days can feel really wrong. I shouldn't feel like this. Yeah, it's because that child is so longed for and so precious that anything other than this is amazing can feel like a real betrayal of all of the things that you've been through. But I think it's something that we all have to accept, no matter what our route has been to parenting, that there is going to be ambivalence, that we cannot enjoy it all the time. And it's a kind of, when you really start to tap into that story, that, and it's not just parenting actually, it is particularly mothering, I think, that we should be enjoying our mothering all of the time and that we should take pleasure from our children all of the time. It's such a powerful myth, and you know, when we really start to kind of tap into it and look at it really critically, how could we possibly enjoy anything all of the time? I mean, I wouldn't even enjoy sitting in a chair reading a book all the time if there was, you know, if I didn't kind of have a opportunity for a reprieve from it. And children, just like all of our other relationships, there are going to be times where we have conflict, where they annoy us, where we don't like them very much. You know, these are all things that we would expect from all of our other relationships, but that myth that we're meant to kind of love our children 100% all the time is such a powerful one. And it's also, I think, such a damaging one, because when you don't feel like that, which most of us don't, you know, you can feel like you're the one who's getting something wrong, because that story is just so powerful. But that is, yeah, absolutely. All of the mothers that I have spoken to in my career have expressed ambivalence about their parenting. So I think we can say that it is pretty much a universal thing. And I think those that don't have a lot of support and are able to lean on people when they feel like, actually, I'm getting to the point where this is getting a little bit too much for me. So Nikki just raised that comment about saying things that we kind of don't necessarily mean to say, that we're just falling into that groove, and she referred to it as a learned behaviour. And I'll just talk a little bit about that, because I'm actually currently putting together an online course around breaking past patterns of parenting, which is all about the way that we, you know, it's not just about learned behaviour in some ways, it's also about the kind of patterns that we have of relating to other people. And when we were talking about conflict earlier, that is one of those. That is one of those things that kind of comes up quite a lot, is how we relate to other people, and how we represent ourselves as well in relation to others. So Philippa Perry talks about this quite a lot in her book, the book that you wish your parents had read, and your children will be glad you did. And one of the things that we can often really surprise us when we become parents is just how much we remember from our own childhoods. Often we can get flooded with memories, but also then how we do kind of get into that very familiar pattern of reacting to situations in the same way that our parents did, even though we always said that we would never do that. And I'm currently putting together an online course that will kind of break down why we do that and what we can do to parent in a way that we feel is kind of more in tune with our own values. And the reason that we do that is, I talked, I think, last time a little bit about attachment theory, but when we are in relationships with our caregivers, they essentially create a blueprint for us. And I talked about this on the Motherkind podcast a few weeks ago. So that is our kind of blueprint of all relationships. So if we are a baby and when we cry, we're met with anger, we can learn an expectation that our feelings will be met with anger. And what usually would happen to a baby then is that they will learn very quickly that it's best not to express feelings, because those feelings will not be met. And that is something that kind of follows us around. So we then will look for that in our other relationships. So that's why you might always end up choosing a partner that you know is completely unsuitable for you. But because you're in that kind of very steady groove, which is what we'd call a self-other representation, if you want the technical term for it, we might then, if we were that baby who was met with anger and our needs weren't met, we might look for people who are also, you know, will respond to us in that similar way. Interestingly, what we can also do, if that is our expectation, is that when we're feeling really, really bad, we might push somebody to the point where they'll be angry with us because that's what we're expecting our response to be. And it takes a lot of work and a lot of kind of digging down where that's come from, what we might want to do differently in order to be able to start kind of breaking those patterns. But it's something that is so kind of primal in all of us, you know, that actually what we'll tap into is our kind of inner representations of what mothers are meant to be. So those are the things that kind of really come out when we're under stress and our, you know, I talk a lot about frontal lobes. Our frontal lobes have gone, so our kind of reasoning has gone, and we're just acting out of instinct. So if there are things that happen where, you know, you hear something coming out of your mouth that you really don't want to be saying, actually the one thing that you can do really quickly to try and sort of prevent that from happening is to really tap into those adrenaline levels, because it's much more likely to happen when your adrenaline is high and you're just ready to explode. That's when your kind of instincts take over rather than that kind of more reasoned, rational response. So I could talk about that for a long time, but if you're interested in hearing more, then I'm hoping to get that online course. I'm just starting to pilot it this week, and I'm hoping to get that up towards the end of November. So if you'd like to know more about that, then please send me a message and I'll add you to the mailing list, so you'll get an email when it's ready to launch. Has anyone got any other questions? I have a feeling that I'm going to get cut off soon because I think that my time is going to run out. If anyone's got any other questions, I think I've just witted for, I have no idea how long I've been on here for. I hope it all made sense. If it didn't, feel free to message me to clarify. And if there are questions that you've got that I haven't talked about, or there's topics that you'd like me to cover when I do this again in November, then please just send me a message and I'll be happy to do that. But yeah, lovely to see you all. Please do come and chat to me afterwards. Hope you all have a really wonderful Friday and a really wonderful weekend. Bye for now. I'm going to try and save it, Tina. I'll try and save it on my highlights. Yeah, lovely to see you all. It's very strange just talking to yourself into a phone on a Friday morning. Bye. Have a lovely day, everybody.